allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Go ahead and call the roll.
Ms. Berkmeyer?
Here.
Mr. Green?
Here.
Mr. Richards?
Here.
Mr. Moses?
He's excused.
Mr. DeRoe? Mr. Venditelli?
Here.
Ms. Knox here.
Okay. So this is the special board meeting for the budget hearing. And so I will accept a motion for approval of the agenda for the special meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion or questions? Okay. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. The next item is a hearing of the public regarding the budget special agenda. I don't have any submissions, so we will move on to the 23-24 budget hearing. Conform to the state legislation, and it's been our budget's been publicized in the newspaper, but also Mr. Rathbun's going to present to us, and then if there's questions or discussion on the board or the audience, we can levy that discussion.
Thank you, Madam President. Yes, this evening we'll be going through our PowerPoint presentation on the public hearing and our truth in taxation. So what we're doing is providing a public hearing for the public to view our budget as well as our millage that we intend to levy for the current year. So I'd like to start out by sharing with you the 2023 taxable values. You'll see that for our non-homestead operating millage, those values increased by about 22 million up to $305 million. We also had an increase in all properties and our debt retirement. So that's the base that we levy our debt mills on. And you can see that increase from about 1.5 up to $1.6 million, or about 7%. So you can see in both cases, we had pretty dramatic increases in our tax base. Whenever you have a dramatic increase in your tax base, oftentimes that can trigger what's called a Headley amendment or a Headley rollback. And what that essentially is, it occurs when your property values are growing faster than the rate of inflation. And the reason for that is that the rollback is put in place many years ago at this point to decrease the millage levy, ensuring that taxpayers do not pay more than they originally agreed to. So as that tax base goes up, if they continue to pay the same rate, then essentially they're paying more, right? So in this particular case, Headley would kick in and reduce that amount that they're paying, the amount of mills that they're paying. So Tim, if I can maybe go to the next slide. So you'll remember back maybe in November of 2019, we did go back out to the voters because we had just that situation where our millage had been rolled back over several years, where the interest rate was going up, or less than the property tax values. The values of the property were increasing faster. So we had a rollback situation, and we got rolled back to about 17.3 mills. The state requires that you levy 18 mills. And if you don't levy that 18 mills, they don't pay you for that difference. You just go without that money. So they passed that 2 mill restoration, and that provided us a hedge as we had been continued to roll back. We've been able to still continue to levy our 18 mills. The interesting part about this year is that even despite those increases of 7 and 8% of our property tax values, we did not have a Headley rollback, which means that inflation kept pace with that 7 or 8%. So we heard about the amount of inflation that was going on here. And you can see that We did not have a rollback this year, meaning that the inflation kept pace with the top property tax values. We also have another regulatory item that we need to attend to, and that's the truth in taxation. So what truth in taxation says is that any increase, regardless of what inflationary rates are doing, any increase can facilitate a rollback unless there's a special vote by the legislative body, which you'll do later today as a part of passing our budget. That will serve to be the act of the legislative body here to approve the mills that we intend to levy. And you can see there that our non-homestead, we intend to levy 18 mills. Debt retirement is not subject to truth in taxation. So we don't have to necessarily consider that in the truth in taxation, but we do with the 18 mills of homestead, non-homestead. So you can see there that we intend to levy, and our budget will reflect this, 18 mills for our non-homestead operating, which is required by the state, and 10 mills for our debt retirement, for a total of 28 mills is what we intend to levy in our 23-24 budget amendment, or original budget, I should say. So here we've got our proposed budget, original budget. I believe everyone should have a copy on your desk if it's small numbers, so I apologize for that. But I'll kind of take you through and talk a little bit about at a high level where we're at, and then I will speak to some of the variances, and we can kind of go through that. As you might imagine, in any budget that we're doing, there are literally thousands of assumptions that go into creating these budgets. So we're going to touch on the high level ones, and then if you've got questions, certainly we'll answer those. So you can see in that middle column that's highlighted in the yellow, that is our 22-23 final budget. We'll talk about that during the board meeting proper. The third column over, highlighted in light blue, that is our 23-24 proposed original budget. And I'd like to take you through that right now. You can see for the 23-24 budget that we are proposing roughly $76 million in revenues for our general operating fund. That's down about $3 million from the 22-23 school year, and we'll talk about that variance in just a few minutes. We also have expenditures that we're projecting of about $75.1 million, which is also down from the $76.4 million that we had in 22-23. That's a decrease of about $1.3 million. We are projecting for 23-24 that we'll make about $1 million. And when you add that to the beginning balance of the 22-23 ending balance there of $9.9 million, that should bring us to about $10.9 million, just under $11 million. And as a percentage, that's about 14.57%. I will highlight just one thing here before we move on to all the assumptions. We're projecting to make about $1 million. This is a conservative bent, and we'll touch on that several times as we go through the assumptions. But you'll also see during the regular board meeting that we're projecting to borrow about $1.2 million from the state to kind of help us through that September period when we don't receive our state aid. By adding this $1 million here in 23-24, we're very confident that that will get us to a point where we won't have to necessarily borrow during that period of time, that our reserves will be sufficient enough that we'll be able to avoid that required borrowing. So I just thought that would be important to point out to you all and make sure you're aware of that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions here that go into, Tim, if I can have you, into our revenue. So we are assuming a decrease of about 100 students for next year. That results in a decrease in our current revenue of about $926,000, the decrease of 100 students. The good news is we are expecting a foundational allowance of about $450 per pupil. multiplied by the 5,330 that we're estimating, that's an increase to our foundation of just under $2.4 million. So one of the things I want to point out, and one of the assumptions is we do not have a state aid budget yet. So we are hoping that that will happen sooner rather than later. But what we've done in the meantime is we've kind of picked the middle of the possible foundation allowance amounts. This is the governor's projection. The state and the House were on both sides of that, higher and lower. And so we're kind of picking the one in the middle. We think that's probably some pretty close to where we'll end up, but obviously still don't know for sure. We also, with respect to all of our categoricals, we did not necessarily include a lot of information about categoricals because those are really kind of even more or less known at this point, but we did add about $200,000 for our special ed funding. That's an increase of about 12.5%. It's quite possible that goes to 25%. And so we would see a doubling of that. We've also eliminated a lot of the Section 97 and 98 grants at this point in time. That totals about $900,000 for us. Really believe that we will see the Section 97 school safety grant come back in the state aid. At this point, we're not including it. We're being very conservative, but we think that probably will make its way into the final State Aid Act, and that we'll get about $600,000. There's some talk about whether that could be over 2 years or how that will be necessarily awarded, but we do think a large part of that will come back to us. Our ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 grants, we will continue to utilize those in 23-24. We're projecting that we'll have about $400,000 less than we had last year. And that's just because the grant was awarded over 2 years. We used a little bit more in the first year than we're using in the second year. We also have a child care stabilization grant, $1.3 million there. That is something that is at this point in time, there's no discussion at all about extending that into next year. So we have removed that from the grant. Our Section 31O, you'll remember this came out 2 years ago, I guess, at this point, right? And so that was really to help us go out and hire additional counselors, social workers, psychs to, help our students with mental health. We have done that. We've gone out and purchased, I think we've added 7 or 8 positions at this point. And we intend, just added another social worker actually. So we now have a social worker at each of our buildings, which is great. But unfortunately, the grant every year kind of decreases the amount that they give you as reimbursement for those folks. We also have our enhancement millage that was passed in Macomb County here. We're expecting about $183,000 increase in that. And then the last item, and we'll touch on this as well on the expense side, but our MIPSers retirement, we received a one-time deposit of about $3.3 million. We don't know if that same revenue will flow through this year. So we're decreasing that. But we also know that we'll receive some additional MIPSers money to offset some of our costs. So we're kind of netting this at about $2.7 million decrease on the revenue that we'll receive from MIPSers. Again, without having the State Aid Budget Act in place, we don't know exactly what revenues we will receive on that. Flipping to the next page, we'll talk about some of the expense assumptions. First one I'd like to talk about is we're adding some educational initiatives. So we're doing some professional development, some merit pay, and we're also looking at some of our pop-up classes and some of our educational enhancement classes. And so we've added about $190,000 for that those initiatives. We're also in a situation where we have a pretty good handle on what we think our increase in wages is going to be. Fortunately, we have long-term contracts. It's really nice from a budgeting standpoint to have those long-term contracts because we have a really good handle on how much we're going to be paying our staff into the future. And fully loaded with retirement on top of that, we're looking at about $1.7 million increase. We've also added some positions across our district. I'll highlight a few of those. We've added a grounds person. We've added a director of security, a director of elementary education. And as I talked about earlier, we've added a social worker so that now all of our elementary schools do have a social worker full-time at those schools. We are also reticent of the increase in the annual retirement rate. So we've increased our UAAL to 16.89%. That's a pass-through, like we talked about a little bit earlier, pass-through where we get the money from MIPSers, we incorporate it into our expenditures, and we send it back to MIPSers. We've also increased the retirement rate capped at 31.34%. So when you combine those two together, which we have to do, you can see our retirement rate is about 50% on the dollar. So for every dollar we spend in salary, we spend about 50% of that in retirement. Like we talked about on the revenue side, we are also eliminating the $3.3 million worth of expense. So we got a $3.3 million influx of cash revenue. We had $3.3 million go out to MIPSers. We don't know if we'll have any sort of pass through again this year. So we've removed that from both sides, the revenue and the expense. We've increased our health insurance benefits and hard cap rates for the coming year. And that is incorporated into our projected numbers. We've eliminated prior year grant expenditures. So we talked about some of that on the revenue side, some of the grants that we don't know or don't think will be coming back. We've eliminated those grant expenditures to match the eliminated revenues. And then finally, we have an increase to our general liability insurance of about $100,000. And this was a little frustrating for Robin and I can tell you, because we sat down with our representative and talked to him about how, he showed us how all of our claims from workers' comp, from general liability had all gone down. They're really good at this point in time, but yet we're still getting an increase. And it's just because the inflationary cost to rebuild any sort of, casualty loss that we might have has gone up significantly. They were talking about, it used to be about $280 a square foot. It's gone up to $350 a square foot, which is consistent with what we're seeing on in our bond when we're working with Barton Malow on that. So those are kind of some of the, Tim, if I can have you move to the next, those are some of the highlights of the expense side. You can see here, I just wanted to add this as a historical look at fund balance. You can see that back in 2014-15, we're just under 8%, kind of went up. We came down all the way to about just under 3% in 2019-20. And since then, we've continued to increase our fund balance. Our hope and our stated goal is to hit 15%. We think at that point, we'll continue to, you'll see that line, instead of climbing, we'll start to level out. And we think that's important because we think that dollar amount is about the correct amount that we need, as we talked about earlier, where we're not borrowing from the state in the fall because we don't have enough reserves for cash flow to meet all of the operating requirements that we have during that period of time. And that will also give us a nice nest egg that if we have an educational initiative that the board wants to take on, we've got some monies there to do that. So this is important. We think that's, this is really getting us to a point of economic stability for the district, which is fantastic. So at this point, I would take any questions that the board may have about the presentation here tonight.
Well, I'll open it up for the board. If anybody has any questions, just jump in. Okay, I think we're good.
All right, hearing none, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So that concludes the special Board of Education meeting that began at 6:30. With no other items on this agenda, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Right, motion passes. So the meeting adjourns at 6:57. Our next meeting will start at 7 o'clock.